Welcome back, everybody. Let's dive right in today. We're tackling AI coding tools.
Yeah.
We've got a ton of insights from developers who are actually using these things, day in and day out. And we're going to see if we can separate the hype from reality.
Yeah, it's pretty wild out there. It seems like every other day there's some new AI coding tool. People are
Mm.
saying this is going to change everything, or, some people say it's all smoke and mirrors.
Right.
So let's dig in. Let's see what AI coding can really do for us.
For sure, for sure. And, our source material this week dives right into that. And the big takeaway seems to be that these AI tools are more like really powerful assistants, right? Not replacements for skilled developers.
That's right. I mean, that's the consensus so far. Yeah, the developers we're hearing from, they're saying AI can help generate code. It can do some pretty impressive stuff, especially for those common tasks, those repetitive things you just don't want to do. But this still needs a human, calling the shots, especially when things get complicated.
Right. Okay, so let's get specific. The source lays out some pretty cool use cases where AI really shines, like generating those utility functions. Everyone needs them. Nobody wants to write them.
Right.
Like file size conversions. Apparently, AI can crank those out like nobody's business.
Yeah, and that's where you see the real efficiency boost, right? I mean, if for that kind of simple code generation, developers are reporting saving like 95% of their time. I mean, think about that. 95%. It's like having like an extra developer on the team just to handle those little annoying tasks.
It's incredible. 95%. That's wild. But as you might expect, the more complex you get, well, the less AI can do. So what happens when the code gets trickier?
Well, those efficiency gains, they start to shrink a little bit. For example, if you're building a whole component within a framework like Vue.js, the time savings drop to about 40%.
Okay.
Still helpful, sure, yeah. But it shows that AI is more about like augmenting our skills, not taking our jobs. And even at 40%, you got to think that's half a day back every week. What could you do with an extra half day?
Oh, yeah. That's a lot of time.
Yeah.
Especially if you can use that time to really dive into problems, get creative. But you're right. It takes a human who gets Vue.js to work with the AI and make sure what it spits out is actually good.
And that's where the skill level of the developer comes in. They found that junior developers, they're seeing even bigger time savings with AI, especially on those simpler tasks. It's like having, a senior dev looking over your shoulder, making suggestions, catching those little mistakes early on.
That's got to be huge for learning, picking up those good habits early in your career. But even really experienced developers are finding value here.
Yeah.
Like the source raves about AI for explaining existing code, those massive code bases we all dread working in.
Yeah.
It can really help make sense of it all.
Oh, for sure. Instead of spending hours, days trying to figure out what someone else wrote, you can get a quick explanation from the AI. Then you can actually dive into the details, right?
Right.
You know what you're looking at. It's
Yeah.
way more efficient.
Okay, so AI can be a big help for certain tasks, but, and the source doesn't shy away from this, there are limitations, right? Like it sounds like complex business logic is still a major sticking point.
Yeah, and that's really the heart of it, right? Where AI still struggles. It can follow instructions, it can learn patterns. But when it comes to the why, understanding the logic behind business rules and then actually translating that into good code, humans still have the edge.
So we have AI that can write code like a pro, but it can't always figure out why that code needs to exist in the first place.
Exactly. And that kind of leads into another area where AI stumbles a bit, accurate documentation.
Okay.
The source specifically calls out Git commit messages.
Oh, yeah.
AI can put words together, sure, but it's tough to capture, the essence of code changes in a way that actually makes sense to other humans.
Yeah, we've all been there trying to decipher a commit message from weeks ago. It's like, what were you even doing?
Totally. A clear, concise commit message is gold, pure gold.
Absolutely. And that's another area where developers, at least for now, still have the upper hand.
Right. And one more limitation to keep in mind. Those very large files, remember those input length restrictions we talked about? They can really trip up these tools, especially when you're dealing with a massive code base.
Right, right. Good reminder that these tools are powerful, but they're not perfect. Okay, so let's say we are using AI coding for the right tasks, keeping it within the right scope. How do we actually make sure we're getting the most out of it and avoid those pitfalls?
Well, the source offers some really good best practices for working with these AI coding tools. And honestly, it boils down to communication, iteration, and a healthy dose of skepticism.
Okay, Let's break that down a bit. What does communication even mean when you're talking about AI? It's not like we're having a conversation here, is it?
Yeah.
Not exactly a chat over coffee, no. But it's about being really, really specific with the instructions you give to the AI. Think of it this way. The more context you provide, clear code comments, variable names that actually make sense, breaking down those big, hairy tasks into smaller chunks, the better the AI can understand what you're trying to do.
So it's almost like we have to teach the AI to think like a developer, at least for that project.
Yeah, you could say that. It's about giving the AI the tools it needs to be helpful. And that leads right into the iterative approach. Don't expect the AI to nail it on the first try, right?
Right.
It's a process. You give it input, it generates some code, you look it over, make some tweaks, and then you do it again. And again until you get what you need. It's a collaboration, really.
It's like finding that balance, between human intuition and the AI's ability to just process information so quickly. But you also mentioned skepticism. Why is that so important?
Because just because the AI spits out code doesn't mean it's automatically good code, right? Or the most efficient way to do things. Developers still need to review everything, test it thoroughly. That's how you prevent bugs, and that's how you make sure that what the AI is doing actually aligns with the bigger goals of the project.
It's like having a superpowered intern. You wouldn't just trust them to write code without looking it over first, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. The source dives into some really specific examples of how AI coding is changing the game.
Yeah, and this is where those efficiency gains really start to come into focus. The source breaks it down by task, and some of these numbers are pretty impressive.
Okay, give me the highlights.
Well, for CSS styling, it can be a huge time saver, especially when you give the AI some context to work with. Like, imagine you can describe a button style. I need a button, make it look clickable, but subtle, with a modern font. And the AI spits out, like 3 different CSS options based on that.
Oh, wow. So no more spending hours tweaking margins and padding.
That's the idea. The developers they talked to reported a 70% efficiency gain for CSS styling when they used context. That's huge.
Wow.
And it's not just about styling either. The source also highlighted AI's potential for unit testing.
Oh, okay. Now that's something I can definitely use some help with. But isn't unit testing really about understanding the logic of the code?
It is. But the source found that even then, AI can be a huge help, especially for testing those simpler functions, components. We're talking a 50% efficiency gain for generating unit tests. Of course, as the code gets more complex, that's where you need that human oversight.
Great. You'd want someone to double check those tests, make sure
Yeah.
they're really testing the important
No,
stuff.
for sure. But even if the AI-generated tests aren't perfect right out of the gate, they're a really good starting point. And they can save a ton of time. Plus, the AI can help identify areas of your code that don't have enough test coverage, which is really valuable for figuring out where to focus your efforts.
Oh, that's interesting. Knowing where to focus your testing can make a huge difference in catching those bugs early on.
Absolutely.
So it's not about replacing developers, it's about giving them superpowers.
Exactly. Let the AI handle the tedious stuff, right? Then the developers are free to focus on the really challenging creative work.
That sounds almost too good to be true. But I know there's always another side to every story. What are some of the potential downsides, some of the challenges that the source brought up?
Well, one thing is those large files, they can still be a problem.
Right. Yeah. Because of those input limits we were talking about.
Exactly. It's like trying to stuff a whole Thanksgiving feast into a tiny little lunchbox. At some point, something has to give.
Right. So even with AI helping out, we can't totally escape those big code bases and the challenges they bring. I guess it's all about using the right tool for the job.
For sure. And remembering these AI tools, they're here to make our lives easier, not to replace us entirely. Which brings us back to those best practices, clear communication, that back and forth process. That's how we get the most out of these tools.
It's a partnership just like anything else in software development.
Well said. And speaking of partnerships, the source ends on a really interesting note about how this whole developer AI thing might shape the future of the field.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the big takeaway?
They're suggesting that AI coding tools, they may not replace developers completely, but they could totally change what skills are important, what companies are looking for.
So not just being able to write good code, but being able to work well with the AI.
Exactly. Like, imagine a world where developers are judged not just on their coding skills, but also on how well they can explain problems to the AI, guide it toward the right solution.
Yeah.
Step in when that human touch is needed.
So the AI becomes almost like an extension of the developer's mind, a tool that makes them even better at solving problems.
That's the idea. And maybe in this future, the best developers aren't the ones writing the most elegant code, but the ones asking the most insightful questions, the ones who can see the big picture and the little details at the same time. They become like bridge builders between human intuition and artificial intelligence.
That's a really powerful image, and it definitely seems like we're entering a fascinating new era in software development.
Exciting, for sure.
Yeah,
Maybe a little daunting, too, but one thing is for certain AI coding tools, they're here to stay. And the developers who can learn to work with them, adapt to this new reality, they're the ones who are going to shape the future.
absolutely. And who knows, maybe one day we'll be doing a whole deep dive on code written entirely by AI. But until then, this has been a fascinating look at this evolving world of software development. Thanks for joining us and keep on coding, everyone.